Hello and welcome to the Dailies. Today's press is dominated by US-Iran nuclear talks in Geneva set against military escalation in the Middle East, the widening fallout from newly released Epstein files, triggering resignations and investigations, and also fresh debates over media independence in the United States. At the same time, papers reflected on the legacy of civil rights leader Jesse Jackson and growing transatlantic tensions exposed at the Munich Security Conference. U.S. headlines also were dominated by foreign policy tensions and political fallout at home. The Trump administration faced scrutiny over Iran talks and military pressure in the Middle East, while new Epstein-related disclosures, as we said, continue to trigger resignations and investigations. At the same time, debates over media independence, regulation, and election politics underscore the climate of heightened polarization and uncertainty. The New York Times reports cautious optimism after indirect talks between the United States and Iran in Geneva, where Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said both sides agreed on a set of guiding principles and to exchange draft proposals. The piece notes Iran has signaled willingness to suspend uranium enrichment for several years and also dilute its stockpile under international inspection in return for lifting banking and oil sanctions. It highlights how progress was described as constructive, even though a deal is not imminent. Now, with talks also overshadowed by U.S. military pressure and also Iranians warning amid high regional tensions. The New York Times also argues that President Donald Trump is deliberately reshaping U.S. foreign policy by bypassing traditional diplomats and institutions in favor of trusted personal envoys. The analysis contends that by relying on Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump is betting that deal-making instincts and personal relationships can resolve the Iran nuclear crisis and the Ukraine war more effectively than formal diplomacy. It goes on to say that the approach offers speed and flexibility, but risks inexperience, conflicts of interests, and also adversaries exploiting delays, raising questions about whether diplomacy without diplomats can deliver lasting results. The Wall Street Journal highlights the widening gap between the United States and Iran after the Geneva talks. The Vice President J.D. Vance accused Tehran of ignoring core U.S. demands. Now, the piece notes that Washington stresses that military options remain on the table and has set a 2-week deadline for progress, while Iran portrays the negotiations as constructive. It underscores a familiar pattern: cautious diplomacy overshadowed by threats, mistrust, and regional military signaling, leaving prospects for a breakthrough uncertain. The Epstein files remained in focus in the U.S., with coverage centering on fallout and accountability, highlighting resignations, investigations, and institutional failures rather than sensational detail. Reporting stressed pressure on the Justice Department, scrutiny of powerful figures, and also warnings from international experts. The overall tone frames the revelations as evidence of a systematic breakdown that allowed abuse to persist for years. The Washington Post examines the global fallout from the latest release of the files, detailing how newly revealed emails and images have triggered resignations and investigations, as well as institutional reckoning. It highlights a striking contrast between Europe, where criminal inquiries and political exits have accelerated, and also the United States, on the other hand, where consequences have been more limited. Rather than alleging new crimes, the piece focuses on reputational damage, poor judgment, and how proximity to Epstein is reshaping careers, power structures, and public accountability. American media also covered Jesse Jackson's death by highlighting his civil rights legacy, his historic presidential campaigns, and his message of empowerment. Coverage placed him as a central figure in post-Martin Luther King Jr. America, while acknowledging controversies alongside his achievements. The Washington Post offers a sweeping, detailed portrait of Jesse Jackson, tracing his rise from a young age to Martin Luther King to most visible civil rights figure in the post-King era. It highlights his unmatched oratory, global activism, and groundbreaking presidential campaigns, while also confronting criticisms of ego, organizational weaknesses, and controversy. The piece balances admiration with scrutiny, portraying Jackson as both inspirational and polarizing. Ultimately, it argues that his greatest legacy lies in expanding Black political participation and reshaping the Democratic Party, paving the way for future leaders while embedding the language of dignity, hope, and resilience into American public life. Axios examines a clash between late-night host Stephen Colbert and CBS after the network advised against airing an interview with Texas Senate candidate James Tallarico. Colbert publicly accused CBS and the FCC of political intimidation, framing the move as censorship under pressure from the Trump administration. The report notes CBS disputes blocking the interview, citing equal time rules. The piece situates the dispute within broader scrutiny of media self-censorship, regulatory ambiguity, and also rising tensions between political power and entertainment platforms in American broadcasting. British headlines today focused on global tensions and political fallout, including UK responses to US-Iran brinkmanship and renewed scrutiny linked to the Epstein files. Domestic coverage also highlights economic strain and questions over government accountability. The Telegraph argues that the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford towards Iran signals a revival of U.S. gunboat diplomacy under Donald Trump. The piece includes several diagrams placing the move in global context, showing the United States with its 11 carriers compared with China's 3 and much smaller fleets operated by Britain, France, and others, underlining Washington's continued dominance. A second diagram as well explaining aircraft carrier range illustrates why the Ford is so powerful. Its aircraft can strike targets more than 1,000 miles away with mid-air refueling without the ship entering hostile waters. Together, the diagrams reinforce the argument that carriers remain central to power projection, deterrence, and negotiation. The Guardian reports on a stark assessment by independent experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, who argue that newly released files on Jeffrey Epstein may document acts rising to the level of crimes against humanity. The piece highlights how the assessment emphasizes the alleged scale, systematic nature, and also global reach of abuse against women and girls, framing it as a coordinated criminal enterprise enabled by power and impunity. The piece also highlights concerns over investigative failures and poor redactions that exposed victims, underscoring calls for an independent, thorough inquiry and also renewed accountability. And we'll end with French media, which focused on the Munich Security Conference, revealing a persistent rift with the United States, despite calmer rhetoric. Coverage emphasized Europe's need for unity and greater strategic autonomy. Le Monde's editorial argues that despite a softer American tone at the Munich Security Conference, the transatlantic divide has indeed deepened. It contrasts Marco Rubio's conciliatory rhetoric with continued U.S. policies that sideline Europe on Ukraine and pressure it to abandon regulatory sovereignty. The article blames Washington for reversing course on Ukraine, notes Europe's growing isolation in supporting Kiev, and urges Europeans to unite. That's it from us today. Thanks for watching the Dailies, only on Al Arabiya English.